Welcome to the Sports Governance Podcast, the place where we dig into the systems, decisions, and power structures that shape sports all around the world. My name is Yunus Filali, and for this fourth episode, we're gonna step back and discuss global sports from a theoretical aspect. In the first episode of this podcast, I asked the basic question: what is sports governance and why does it matter? Since then, we've seen sports operate at very different levels. We saw how political power uses sports symbolically and strategically. And we saw how, on the ground, people who are trying to develop sports have to navigate fragile systems, limited resources, and unequal structures. Because once you understand how power is organized in global sport, everything else, politics, development, reform, resistance, all of this starts to make sense. Let's break it down. To understand global sports governance, we need to let go of one assumption we usually make without noticing it. We tend to associate authority with the states, with laws, police, courts, borders, but a global sport operates almost entirely outside that framework. There is no global government of sport, and yet organizations like FIFA or the IOC exercise real authority across borders. They decide who can compete, they decide who is recognized, they decide who is excluded, and these decisions are largely obeyed. So the question is simple: why? These organizations don't have armies, they don't have prisons, they don't even have formal courts in the traditional sense. What they have instead is control over access to competitions, access to legitimacy, access to careers, funding, visibility, and national prestige. In global sports, exclusion is more powerful than force. If a federation is suspended, it doesn't lose territory, it loses relevance. Let's take a concrete example: Russia. Russia is a sovereign state. It has courts, police, borders, and diplomatic power. And yet, after the revelations of state-sponsored doping, Russia was excluded partially or fully from multiple Olympic Games. No army enforced this. No international court sent police to Moscow. The sanction was symbolic but devastating. No flag, no anthem. Athletes competing under neutral status. What was being punished wasn't territory or sovereignty. It was recognition. Russia didn't go to war over this. It didn't leave the Olympic system. It contested, negotiated, adapted, but it stayed. If an athlete is banned, they don't go to jail. They disappear from the system. This is authority based on dependency, not coercion. Consider Lance Armstrong. At his peak, Armstrong wasn't just an athlete. He was an icon. And yet, when the system turned against him, he lost everything that mattered in sport. His titles were stripped, his results erased, his legacy rewritten. He wasn't jailed. He wasn't fined by criminal courts, but he became irrelevant inside the sporting system. The punishment wasn't legal, it was existential. Outside sports, Armstrong could live freely. Inside sport, he wasn't existing anymore. What's interesting is that states who do have sovereignty largely accept this. They accept private organizations deciding who represents them internationally. They accept rules they did not write. They accept sanctions imposed from outside their legal systems. Why? According to a critical analysis co-authored by Jean-François Bourg and Jean-Jacques Gouguet, states accept constraints because global sport generates value they want: visibility, prestige, soft power, national cohesion. Walking away from the system often costs more than complying with it. This is why even powerful states rarely exit global sports. They negotiate, they pressure, but they eventually say, like we saw with Russia. Global sports works like a closed ecosystem. To matter in sports, you have to be inside it. And once you're inside, your room to maneuver is limited. This applies to athletes, to clubs, to federations, and yes, to states. Authority here doesn't come from law. It comes from the ability to define the boundaries of the game. In global sport, power lies with those who control access to recognition. But authority alone doesn't explain everything. Because the system survives not just because organizations impose rules, but because states allow them to remain autonomous. So the next question becomes, why do states accept the autonomy of sports in the first place? Let's return to Russia. After the doping scandal, Russia constantly spoke the language of sovereignty. National courts, national dignity, national rights. But notice what Russia did not do. It did not leave from the Olympic system. It did not create an alternative global competition. It didn't reject the authority of international sport entirely. Instead, it appealed, it negotiated, it accepted partial compliance, and crucially, Russia accepted that its dispute would not be handled by national courts, but by the Court of Arbitration for Sport. That tells us something important. Autonomy in sport is not about independence. It's about managing conflict outside normal politics. The Court of Arbitration for Sport is a private judicial body. It is not a state court. Its judges are not appointed by governments. And yet, its decisions are accepted by states, athletes, and federations. Why? Because CAS allows states to outsource conflicts. Instead of turning sporting disputes into diplomatic crises, they are turned into technical cases. Instead of politics, law. Instead of sovereignty, procedure. Autonomy works because it depoliticizes conflict that states do not want to handle directly. This is where the idea of autonomy becomes clearer. Sports organizations gain freedom from direct state control. States gain distance from messy, controversial decisions. If an athlete is banned, the government didn't do it. If a country is sanctioned, it wasn't a diplomatic attack. Autonomy allows everyone to deny responsibility while still benefiting from the system. This is not weakness, it's functional. Autonomy works until sport becomes politically sensitive. A few days ago, after a humiliating performance at the AFCON, the Gabonese authorities announced the suspension of the Gabon national football team. This wasn't a federation decision. It was a state intervention. At that moment, autonomy disappeared because the issue was no longer sporting failure. It was national image, public anger, and political legitimacy. Autonomy in sport survives in normal times. It weakens in moments of political shock. Sport is autonomous as long as it remains politically manageable. So, autonomy in sport is neither freedom nor fiction. It is negotiated power, a balance between what sport wants to control and what states are willing to give up. That balance explains why the system usually holds, and why sometimes it cracks. So, if authority explains how sport governs, and autonomy explains why states allow it, the final question is this: what does governance actually mean in this system? Is it about ethics, management, reform, or is it fundamentally about power? When people talk about governance in sports, they often talk about it as a technical problem. Better rules, more transparency, better leadership. And that's understandable, because governance is usually presented that way. But that reframing is misleading, because governance is not primarily about efficiency or morality, it's about power. Management answers questions like, how do we run competitions efficiently? How do we allocate resources? How do we improve performance?
Governance answers different questions. Who has the right to decide? Whose voice counts? And whose interests are structurally prioritized? You can have excellent management inside a deeply unequal system. In fact, good management often stabilizes unequal systems. Governance is not about how decisions are executed. It's about who controls the space in which decisions can be made. This is why transparency and ethics, while important, are not sufficient. Transparency tells you what is happening. Ethics tells you what should happen. Governance tells you who has the power to decide either way. You can publish every decision. You can adopt the strongest ethical codes. If decision-making power remains concentrated, nothing fundamental changes. Opacity hides power, but transparency doesn't redistribute it. This also explains why governance reform is often disappointing. Reforms usually focus on procedures, new committees, new compliance mechanisms, new reporting standards, but they rarely touch the core question. Who ultimately decides? As long as that question remains untouched, reform improves the appearance of governance without changing its substance. This lens changes how we interpret everything we've already discussed on this podcast. When political leaders use sport, they're not politicizing a neutral space. They are exploiting an existing concentration of symbolic and institutional power. When grassroots actors struggle, it's not only because they lack funding or capacity, it's because they operate far from the center of decision making. Governance explains why some actors shape the system, while others are shaped by it. So governance is not a moral question first. It's a structural one. It forces us to ask, who defines the rules? Who enforces them? And who has no meaningful way to challenge them? Once you ask those questions, governance stops being abstract. It becomes political. Authority explains how global sport governs without the state. Autonomy explains why states allow it. And governance explains who benefits from that arrangement. Sport doesn't suffer from a lack of values or expertise. It suffers from a deeply unequal distribution of power. If there is one thing to take away from this episode, it's that global sport is not governed by accident. It is governed through a system that concentrates authority, negotiates autonomy, and distributes power unevenly. That system didn't emerge because it is fair or democratic. It emerged because it works. It works for institutions that control access. It works for states that want visibility without responsibility. And it works, most of the time, by keeping conflict technical rather than political. But understanding how the system works also changes how we see its limits. When athletes demand a voice, they are not asking for better management. They are challenging where power sits. When governments intervene, they are not breaking the rules of sport. They are renegotiating the balance between sovereignty and autonomy. And when governance reforms fail, it's often not because the ideas were wrong. It's because power remained exactly where it was. This is why sports governance matters beyond sport. Because it shows us how authority can exist without the state, how legitimacy can be produced without democracy, and how systems can be remarkably stable, even when they are deeply unequal. In the next episodes, we will come back to concrete issues: athletes, representation, development, geopolitics, but we will do so with this framework in mind. Because once you see governance as power, sports stops being just a game. It becomes a window into how the world is organized. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help shape the next ones, let me know in the comments what topics you would like explored. If you found this useful, make sure to follow the podcast on streaming platforms and LinkedIn. You were listening to the Sports Governance Podcast by Yunus Filali. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time.